Welcome to the session on project-based learning that we're going to share our R&D work. And my name is Scott Hoffman, and I'm a grade 2 teacher. And this is Kevin Crouch, and he is the elementary school tech coordinator. And so just want to start off. Just kind of dive into it. I assume many of you have heard a little bit about the R&D and how it's set up. And as to the members at the start of the year, we had some things on the table that we could choose to study. And
Scott, just a second. Can you increase the volume on the micro, on the actual box?
Wow. Hello, yes. So we jumped at project-based learning, and I think I want to just back up just a little bit and say that one of the reasons that Kevin and I both jumped on this one is because we really care a lot about trying to work with kids as far on the end of the continuum of ownership as possible. And so it's one of the things that I love about the whole R&D framework is that we start off with ownership because we get to choose something that we're interested in for whatever reason. And another thing I want to say is that really this is couched in 21st century skills, and when we think about 21st century skills, sometimes we can talk about them for a long time without really knowing what they mean. And so when we start thinking about skills that you really need for the 21st century, I was thinking a little bit about the last time that I was at an ASB thing and I had to communicate in front of a bunch of people. And in front of several thousand people, I said Instapoot instead of Institute. And so here I am again getting another chance here because communication really is an important 21st century skill. And so that's something that we're working on all the time. And as we've done our R&D work, what we started noticing is that all the R&D work was essentially project-based learning. So all the other groups that are getting up here and sharing, the way they approach their learning is by project-based learning. And so that seems to have some utility for now. Project-based learning, many of you will know, is not really something that's that new. It's, in the 90s it had a pretty good run, and I think the reason it's getting another good run is because people are trying to figure out how to deal with content and skills, 21st century skills. And so that's really why we had a look at project-based learning, because we wanted to see how it could help us with our learning, with our students' learning, but also to really look at 21st century skills and take those seriously and try to teach and learn those.
Okay. Apologize for the small text on this. This is not a trend. Just wanted to show our action plan. So this is how we began the project. Of course, we created a series of SMART goals. So strategic and specific, measurable, attainable, results-based, and time-bound. And I'll just quickly read through them. So we wanted to develop a working understanding, project-based learning. We would gather information on current project-based learning practices from elementary through post-secondary schools. We would gather information about the conditions needed for successful project-based learning, and then assess the impact of project-based learning at those institutions. We would test, field test. We didn't prototype this year. We didn't plan on prototyping anything, so we weren't actually really gathering a lot of research data. We just wanted to test some of our models out. And then essentially we just wanted to, the goal in the end was to be able to provide recommendations to our school for further study, further prototyping, and where do we feel that project-based learning fits at ASB. And then, of course, we want to be done by the end of January.
So one of the first things we did when we met as a group, there were 10 of us in the group, 9 of us in the group, and one of the first things we did was start to think about what are the questions that we really feel like we need to answer. And we used a protocol called the Chalk Talk, and got our questions out. And these are the questions that we started with in order to do our study.
So the way that we gathered research was through a DIGO group that we all joined, and threw in, if you haven't used DIGO, it just allows anybody connected to a group, or you can do it individually if you want, but throw articles, papers and things in there, highlight stuff, comment on stuff that you find interesting that the others might benefit from. We found this to be incredibly useful in keeping our team of teachers, which is put down here on the task force, from high school, middle school, and elementary school with very different schedules, all on board, and thinking about the same thing together.
One thing I'll just mention, as we started doing this, we're in a position where we're kind of facilitating for our peers, and many of you have probably been in situations where you're thinking about how to facilitate for your peers and anticipating the things that can go wrong, or if there's resistance to the way you think it might go. And when we had our first meeting, it was really cool because everybody who signed up for the task force signed up because they had an interest or an experience. And I think that just really helped our group to work. It was like such a pleasure working with our group because people dove in and they had background knowledge or they had desire, and there were no roadblocks to kind of going where we wanted to go, and people just put their best thinking in. So it was really kind of an ideal way to work. And so in our second meeting, we found a piece of research that was looking at project-based learning, reviewing project-based learning. And one of the problems with project-based learning is there's problem-based learning and there's challenge-based learning. We ran into lots of different terminologies as we were looking at different websites and different pieces of research. And so Thomas identified these things as the things that make a project-based learning project a project-based learning project. One of the biggest obstacles to project-based learning understanding is that just about all of us have had an experience in our own schooling with a project. So when you start talking about projects with other people, it's really easy to think that you're speaking the same language when there's a really good chance if you're talking about PBL that you're not talking the same language as someone who's talking about a project. And so this was a really important place for us to get to identify what we were talking about when we were talking about it.
You'll see these, we're going to pepper our presentation with these because this really kind of formed, every one of these is a checkpoint for when we tested out a project, or when we talked with teachers about projects. We always referred back to these. If it meets these criteria, then we're on the right track. We need to explain to a teacher what a project-based learning project is. We would bring this up. We had a planner that had this stuff in it, and we would continue. And we didn't really understand what all of these things meant at first when we started off, so we worked through it ourselves. So it was quite a journey. So, for example, the first one, that projects are central, not peripheral to the curriculum. Scott was just talking about how many of us have either done projects with our kids, or when we were in school we did projects. And as an example of one that you may have done in high school, or maybe you've done with your kids, where you learn about vectors, right? And then you take all that knowledge about vectors and then you build a bridge. Or maybe you just put a bunch of toothpicks together that look like a bridge. And then theoretically that's supposed to help you become an engineer later in life. The reason why this is not a project-based learning project is because you could make this structure without any knowledge of vectors whatsoever, and you may understand vectors really well but have no real-world application knowledge at all about how to use them. So this was a really key starting point for us when thinking about project-based learning.
Okay, so one of the things that seems really essential when you're learning something is know why. And yet, as teachers, a lot of times we're putting our kids in scenarios where they don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. And so one of the things that focus questions are problems that are central to the discipline. So it's really coming up with that essential question that really matters so that it helps the kids and the teacher understand, you know, why are we doing this? What are we doing? What are we trying to get to? And this is just an example from I don't know whose class this was, another teacher. It says, could this be true? Why or why not? And there's a squirrel on one end of the seesaw and a dog on the other end of the seesaw. And the student put, no, because why in the world will a dog or a squirrel sit on a swing? And a lot of times when we teach, we know where we're going. We know the things that we want to kind of offload on the kids. But when we get to the end, we don't have that meaningful context for them, and it's like, well, why in the world would a squirrel and a dog sit on a swing? And so sometimes we get to that same place, actually covering the same, going for the same benchmarks, we get to the same place of, wow, we did all that, and they know all this stuff, but it doesn't have a meaningful context for them. All right. So involving students in constructive investigation. This again is something that really helps me because I like to think of myself as a teacher that's always helping kids become constructivists because I care a lot about constructivism. But when you come to rolling out a unit in the everyday life of a second grade classroom with your team, you're kind of figuring out what do you have to cover, what do you have to teach them, and it's going to start on Tuesday. And so actually making sure, this is like insurance, that kids are actually constructing meaning and understanding instead of you just purveying it, I suppose. So this is just a sample of, this is a unit where we had a group of students visit we have a unit, a PYP unit that was called Very Important People, Very Influential People. And in the past, that's been studying people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and then learning about their lives, a little biography, and so we decided to switch it up with a project-based learning approach this time, and we had a group of students from a school called One International visit our school, and when they showed up, we were all really surprised that they all showed up without shoes, and one of the students showed up with a pretty hurt foot, and we had to have that student go to the nurse, and then one of our other second grade teachers, when we were doing our Critical Friends group, brought this unit up and said, is there a way we could turn this into a project? And so we turned that question, our essential question for the group became, how can second graders at ASB become very influential people? And so once you start asking that question and putting the question in the hands of kids and trying to facilitate that, then it matters what kids say, and it matters their ideas as you're building something together. And that's probably, I think, the biggest shift you have to make to be a project-based learning teacher, is that it's not all coming from you. You're actually trying to get the kids to construct the meaning, and it's a subtle difference, and a lot of people would just say, well, I don't really see the difference between this and normal school, but it's kind of like, where's the thinking coming from?
Okay, so another criteria, projects are student-driven to some degree, and anytime you throw it in the hands of the students, as Scott was just talking about, it's not going to be the trajectory that you had originally planned out. So for those who can't see in the back, it's a diagrams, what people think success looks like, and it's a straight line, but what it really looks like is it goes all over the place, but hopefully you end up getting where you want to go anyway. And so you may have standards, and we really hope you do, but it doesn't mean that the students are going to follow along with your checkpoint of learning at every point of the way in project-based learning. It may be that way in your classroom now, and that's fine, but projects will take completely different paths. That's one of the things we found.
Okay, so this is about the project that we talked about before. So one of the second graders came up with this logo, Save, Help, Donate Shoes, and we this class is trying to make a difference for the One International kids, and so we split into several work groups, from accounting to shoe logistics, advertising, event planning, and there's another one that I've missed. But it was really interesting to see the effect on children and families when this started being the conversation. There's just a big difference between a parent saying, like, well, did you get all the understanding you needed out of that unit? I hope you did well. And a kid bringing something like this home and saying, we are trying to make a difference in Bombay, and here's how we're going to do it. We have a real meaningful context for our learning. Like that. Okay, so now this is getting to the part where we kind of laid out what the project-based learning is, and when we started doing our research, we came back with research about achievement in elementary school, middle school, and high school, and we found across the board. I'll just save you from going into each one, but across the board, what we found is that that achievement and understanding was at least as successful as in other methods of instruction. But the difference was actually being able to elaborate on your thinking about what you learned and being able to apply it. So that was kind of the big thing through all three. We found, I think that's another interesting thing about project-based learning, that we started to see that it was like a K through tertiary school continuum, because a lot of the problem-based learning started in medical schools as a way for their students to actually be able to think on their feet more holistically about what they were learning and to be able to solve problems.
Okay, so I'd just like to talk a little bit about what you're looking at here. We wrote a report for our leadership team. That was the job of our task force in the end, where part of that was actually doing a lot of research, just academic research, reading academic research, and just reporting out on the findings. So we haven't run actual research studies in our classroom, so that this is not where this is coming from. If you hear us talking about we found an article that said so. Okay, so we're not researchers right now. If I were here next year, I probably would become a researcher for this, but not yet. So what we found out about content area achievement was that you do need to maintain rigorous standards, of course, but that a lot of the contention against project-based learning is that you cannot achieve rigorous standards. You cannot have a project-based learning school and have rigorous standards for your students. And the research definitely discredited that, so that you can indeed have rigorous standards and have your kids working in projects. And that they will do, as Scott said earlier, at least as well on the standardized tests as their non-project-based learning schools. The thing is what they do much better at are assessments that ask for real-world application of the knowledge that they have learned. They do at least as well on the standardized tests, but they do much better than their non-project-based learning peers on assessments that ask for real-world application of knowledge.
Okay, so motivation and engagement was a really strong point for project-based learning. They said that projects that had varying tasks that included novel elements, and the problem is challenging, and the students had significant choice and opportunities to collaborate, were highly motivated for students. So one of the reports that came back said these are the elements that make it highly motivating.
Incredible impact on the 21st century skills, including collaboration and cooperation, which go hand in hand with critical thinking, which will be next. The research showed us that collaboration and cooperation is impacted by giving kids much better conflict resolution skills. They're able to negotiate and solve problems together as a team because we're talking about consensus building, talking about combining social skills and higher order thinking skills together to help solve problems. And they tend to look through project-based learning. Students that go to project-based learning schools tend to look at problems from multiple perspectives instead of from one perspective at non-project-based learning schools.
Okay, so one of the things about higher order thinking skills is higher order thinking skills don't come out unless you have assessments that are built to show higher order thinking skills. So that was one of the findings, is that you needed to be able to develop assessments at the start of your PBL unit so that you knew what you were assessing, and it also increased the likelihood that you were explicitly teaching higher order thinking skills or collaboration skills or communication skills. And that students that were in project-based learning projects had better hypothesis because they kind of worked as their projects were like a continual hypothesis, and then more coherent arguments.
So this was one of our big questions as well: is how are many disciplines in a school supported? Can project-based learning work well in an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary context? And there's not a ton of research out there on this, but what it does say is that the two, though they're very different, topics or ideas, that they are mutually supportive. And that might not be, news to anybody here, but the questions continually come up about, can I have a multidisciplinary curriculum and project-based learning? Part of this is because real-world problems are multidisciplinary problems. Real-world problems involve writing and math and social studies, often. Gardening, various things. But one of the stumbling blocks to this is that teachers have to collaborate. They have to have time together. They have to be, essentially trained to work together. They have to be able to agree with each other on what gets taught. They can't be stuck in their own domains and think, well, I can't work with a math teacher because they don't understand physics. People have to be able to work together, and the school has to set up structures that allow that to happen. So essentially, the research logic goes as follows. If you run project-based learning, there are many opportunities for interdisciplinary learning. If you already do interdisciplinary learning, then your teachers are naturally set up to do project-based learning, so that shouldn't hold anybody back. So Scott and I are also doing a presentation on Saturday at 1 o'clock. It's essentially the same presentation except for we're going for an hour. So if you've seen that and you've marked it, feel free to come and tweet or whatever for the first half an hour and then listen to the rest of it, because at that presentation we'll show the examples of the tests that we ran, how we ran projects in a PYP program, and we don't have any middle school teachers doing that, but we have a couple of examples, and how we fit those projects into, those PYP units into our project-based learning criteria, those 5 things that we went over. But we'd like to open it up now for questions, and you might have to pass the microphone back unless you can speak up.
One of the issues I hear about when I talk about PBL is what's already packed into the curriculum and the time that the teachers have, which is touched on time. You're talking about meeting time, but what teachers tell me is, great, I need to teach these kids these 5 concepts. Telling them takes 10 minutes, and then running a test on it and assessing it like I'm supposed to do is another 10 minutes. Doing a project on it is 3 classes, and I just don't have 3 extra classes to devote to that time. What would you say? What do you say to teachers contact?
It's a great question, and that question came up from our R&D team when we presented our report to them, and they said that one thing that we need to recommend is that every division goes through and really culls their curriculum and the expectations of their content and really focuses on the most important things. And so what the paradigm shifts from as much content as you can that they won't retain to less content It's much deeper. It's retained for a lifetime.
Can you say it again? I'm recording it for my curriculum.
The report will come out in a couple months. We'll make sure everybody here can get that out.
Yeah, I think that's, a lot of this really comes down, I think, to a belief. It's actually expressing your belief through curriculum, because this approach is an approach that says we actually do believe that 21st century skills are more important than trying to cover a vastly expanding and I think that's the hardest shift for me to make, even though I know it, is we think that there's this precious content that absolutely must be covered, and where do you draw the lines on that? And I think it really comes out, what kind of kids do you want? What do you want your kids to be able to do instead of what do you want to pack into them?
Sandy.
Is project-based learning more of a summative assessment or ongoing practice?
The question is project-based learning more of a summative assessment or an ongoing practice? No. Project-based learning starts day one of the unit. It is not a summative. It includes a summative, but will also include many formative assessments, many engagements, and whatever else the children want to include in their inquiry process for their project. So the students are constructing most of that knowledge themselves with the aid of the teacher, with very well thought out engagements and formative assessments to make sure that the students are working towards their goal.
Yeah, that's where the architecture of the project is really important, and a lot of when we read over and over were teachers saying that most of the work went into the planning of the unit was super important, so that it was set up with an architecture that would succeed, and then after that they were basically formative assessors and facilitators.
One thing I'd like to add on to that too is that if you're familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? This is something that students in a project-based learning school will constantly be dealing with. They will be looking at a problem that they have no idea how to solve. And to get to a point where they understand the problem and their path is going to take large leaps for them cognitively, and learning skills and content along the way to do that. So, it's certainly not a summative assessment. It's deriving their learning from the very beginning. All right, well, thanks for coming. Thanks for